before we begin this incredible story, please subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon so you never miss out on amazing stories like this one. Now, let's dive into a tale that will leave you speechless. The rain hammered against the ancient windows of Buckingham Palace as Thomas Bennet stood at his post in the East Gallery. He had been a royal guard for 12 years, and in all that time, nothing extraordinary had ever happened during his watch. The tourists came and went, the ceremonies proceeded like clockwork, and life inside the palace walls followed the same predictable rhythm it had for centuries. Thomas often wondered if anything truly surprising could still happen in a place so steeped in tradition and routine that November evening started like any other. The palace had closed to visitors hours ago, and most of the staff had gone home for the night. Thomas walked his usual route through the dimly lit corridors, his footsteps echoing off the marble floors. The portraits of long-dead monarchs stared down at him from their gilded frames, their painted eyes seeming to follow his movement through the shadows. He had walked this path so many times that he could navigate it blindfolded, knowing exactly where each squeaky floorboard lay and which corners held the coldest drafts as he turned down a corridor leading to the old servant quarters. Something caught his attention. A door that was usually locked stood slightly ajar. Thomas paused, his hand instinctively moving to the radio clipped to his belt. The door led to a storage room that housed old furniture and forgotten relics from past renovations. Nobody had any reason to be in there, especially not at this hour. His training kicked in immediately, and he approached the door with careful, measured steps. He pushed the door open slowly, wincing as the old hinges creaked in protest. The room beyond was dark except for a sliver of moonlight streaming through a high window. Dust particles danced in the pale beam, disturbed by the opening door. Thomas reached for his flashlight and swept the beam across the cluttered space. Covered furniture created strange shapes in the darkness, and cobwebs stretched between abandoned picture frames and rolled carpets. Everything seemed undisturbed, yet something felt wrong. The air in the room felt different, as if someone had recently been there. He was about to leave when his flashlight beam caught something unusual. In the far corner of the room, behind a stack of old chairs, one of the wooden floorboards appeared to be lifted slightly. Thomas made his way through the maze of forgotten furniture, his curiosity now fully aroused. When he reached the corner, he knelt down and examined the floorboard more closely. It was definitely loose, and there were fresh scratches around its edges. As if someone had recently pried it up, Thomas glanced around the empty room, feeling suddenly uneasy. His heart began to beat faster as he carefully lifted the loose board. Beneath it lay a small metal box, covered in decades of dust, but clearly placed there deliberately. The box was old-fashioned, made of tin with a simple clasp that had rusted over time. He pulled it out carefully, surprised by its weight. Whatever was inside felt substantial. Sitting back on his heels, Thomas wiped the dust from the box's lid. His mind raced with possibilities. Should he report this immediately? Should he open it? The protocol said he should contact his supervisor, but his curiosity burned too bright to ignore. After 12 years of uneventful patrols, had finally discovered something mysterious, something that might actually matter. He took a deep breath and opened the clasp. Inside the box lay a collection of yellowed letters tied with a faded ribbon, several old photographs, and a small leather journal. Thomas picked up one of the photographs, angling it toward his flashlight. The image showed a young woman in clothing from the early 20th century, standing in what appeared to be the palace gardens. She was beautiful, with kind eyes and a gentle smile. On the back of the photograph, written in elegant handwriting, were the words, "Elizabeth, Summer 1923. Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. He carefully untied the ribbon around the letters and opened the first one. The paper was fragile, threatening to crumble at his touch. As he began to read the first few lines, his eyes widened in disbelief. This was no ordinary correspondence. The letter spoke of love, of secret meetings, and of a relationship that had to remain hidden from the world. The signature at the bottom made his hands tremble. This discovery was bigger than anything he could have imagined, and it was about to change everything he thought he knew about the royal family's history. Thomas sat on the dusty floor of the storage room, the metal box resting on his lap as he continued reading through the letters. Each one revealed more details about a forbidden romance that had taken place nearly a century ago. The photograph, Elizabeth, had been a housemaid at the palace. The letters were written to her by someone whose identity became clearer with each page Thomas turned. His hands shook as he realized he was holding evidence of a secret that the royal family had managed to keep hidden for generations. The letters spoke of stolen moments in the palace gardens, of meetings in hidden corners, where the couple could be themselves without the weight of their different social positions crushing down upon them. The writing was passionate and sincere, filled with promises of a future together that both parties seemed to know was impossible. Once Thomas read about picnics by the lake, about shared laughter during formal dinners when they could only communicate through glances, about the agony of maintaining distance in public while their hearts pulled them together. One letter in particular caught Thomas's attention. It was dated December 1924, and the tone was different from the others. The writer spoke of a decision that had to be made, of duty versus love, of the impossible choice between personal happiness and responsibility to the crown. The letter ended with words that made Thomas's throat tighten. My dearest Elizabeth, know that whatever happens, whatever path I must take, you will always be the keeper of my true heart. What we have shared in these precious months is more real than any crown or title could ever be. Thomas carefully set the letters aside and picked up the small leather journal. The cover was worn smooth by time and handling, and when he opened it, he found pages filled with the same elegant handwriting. This was Elizabeth's diary, her personal record of the relationship. As Thomas began to read, he discovered details that the letters had not revealed. Elizabeth wrote about her fears of being discovered, about the other servants who had begun to suspect something, about the constant anxiety of maintaining the secret. But there was something else in the diary that shocked Thomas even more. Elizabeth had become pregnant. The entries from early 1925 spoke of her terror and confusion, secret visits to a doctor in a neighboring town, of the impossible decision she faced. She could not tell her lover, she wrote, because it would destroy everything he had worked for, everything his family expected of him. The weight of her secret was crushing her, and her words on the page showed a woman being torn apart by circumstance. Thomas flipped through the pages frantically, searching for what happened next. The entries became sporadic after the pregnancy revelation. Elizabeth wrote about leaving the palace suddenly, about moving to a cottage in the countryside that had been arranged through a mysterious benefactor. She wrote about giving birth to a baby boy in the spring of 1925, alone except for a midwife who had been sworn to secrecy. The pain in her words was palpable, and Thomas found himself deeply moved by this woman's suffering from so long ago. The final entries in the diary were the most heartbreaking. Elizabeth wrote about the baby being taken from her just days after his birth. She had been told he would be given to a good family, people who could provide for him properly, people who would never know the truth of his parentage. Elizabeth had been paid a sum of money that seemed generous but felt like blood money to her. She was instructed never to speak of what had happened, never to try to contact the child, and never to return to London. The last entry was dated May 1925, and it simply read, I have lost everything. My love, my child, my home. I pray that one day someone will find these words and know that we existed, that our love was real, that my son was born from something beautiful, even if the world could never accept it. Thomas closed the diary and sat in silence, processing everything he had just read. This was not just a historical curiosity or an interesting footnote. If what he suspected was true, this secret had living descendants, people walking around today who had no idea about their connection to the royal family. The implications were staggering. He thought about the protocols he was supposed to follow, about the chain of command that governed every aspect of Palace's life. But he also thought about Elizabeth, about her pain and her hope that someone would one day discover her truth. He carefully placed everything back in the metal box and closed the lid. Standing up, Thomas brushed the dust from his uniform and made his decision. He could not simply report this through normal channels and let it disappear into some archive, forgotten once again. This story deserved to be told, but he needed to be smart about how he proceeded. He needed to verify the facts, to find out if there were any living descendants, to understand the full scope of what this discovery meant. As he left the storage room, carefully locking the door behind him, Thomas had no idea that his discovery would soon send shockwaves through the palace and beyond. The truth that Elizabeth had hoped would one day surface was finally beginning to emerge from the shadows. Nothing would ever be quite the same again. Thomas barely slept that night. He had hidden the metal box in his locker at the palace, knowing it would be safe there, while he figured out his next move. The following morning, he arrived for his shift, exhausted but determined. During his break, he went to the palace library, a vast room filled with historical records and archives that most staff members never bothered to explore. He needed to find out more about Elizabeth and verify the details from her diary. The librarian, an elderly woman named Mrs. Patterson, who had worked at the palace for 40 years, looked surprised when Thomas approached her desk. Guards rarely came to the library, and she could see the intensity in his eyes. He asked her about employment records from the 1920s, explaining that he was researching his family history and believed a relative might have worked at the palace. Mrs. Patterson was happy to help, leading him to a section filled with dusty ledgers that contained names of all palace employees going back to the 18th century. Thomas spent hours poring over the records, his finger tracing down columns of names until he finally found what he was looking for. Elizabeth Mary Thompson, hired as a housemaid in April 1922, left employment in February 1925. The reason for departure was listed simply as personal circumstances. His heart raced as he confirmed that Elizabeth had been real, that her story was not some elaborate fiction. Mrs. Patterson noticed his excitement and asked if he had found what he was looking for. Thomas nodded, trying to keep his emotions in check, and thanked her for her help. Over the next several days, Thomas conducted his own investigation during his off hours. He visited the local records office and searched through birth certificates from 1925. It took patience and persistence. But eventually he found a record for a baby boy born in a small village outside London in April of that year. The mother was listed as Elizabeth Thompson, but the father's name was blank. The child had been named James Thompson. Thomas photographed the certificate with his phone, his hands trembling slightly as he realized he was building a trail that connected the past to the present. Finding out what happened to James proved more difficult. Adoption records from that era were sealed, and Thomas had no legal authority to access them. He spent his evenings in internet cafes, searching through genealogy websites and historical databases. The search felt like looking for a needle in a haystack, but Thomas had always been methodical and patient. Those qualities had made him a good guard. Now they were helping him piece together a mystery that had been buried for decades. His breakthrough came from an unexpected source. While searching through old newspaper archives online, Thomas found a small article from 1943 about a young pilot named James Thompson, who had distinguished himself in the Royal Air Force during World War II. The article mentioned that James had been raised by a family in Cornwall. After being orphaned as an infant, Thomas felt his pulse quicken as he read the details. The age matched perfectly. This had to be Elizabeth's son. Thomas continued tracing James's life through public records. After the war, James had married and settled in Manchester, where he worked as a teacher. He had 3 children, and those children had children of their own. Thomas created a family tree on paper, mapping out the descendants of Elizabeth and her forbidden lover. Some of James's grandchildren were still alive, living ordinary lives across England, completely unaware of the royal blood that flowed through their veins. As Thomas pieced together this information, he wrestled with a growing ethical dilemma. What right did he have to disrupt these people's lives with this revelation? They had families, careers, identities that had nothing to do with royalty. But at the same time, didn't they have a right to know the truth about their ancestry? And what about the historical significance? This was not just a private family matter. It was part of the nation's history, a hidden chapter that shed new light on the human side of the royal family. Thomas confided in his sister, Margaret, who was a journalist. He showed her copies of the letters and diary entries, careful not to reveal the identity of Elizabeth's lover just yet. Margaret was stunned by the material. She recognized immediately that this was an incredible story, but she also understood her brother's hesitation. They discussed the implications late into the night, weighing the public's right to know against the privacy of the individuals involved. Margaret suggested they try to contact one of James Thompson's descendants before going public with anything. If they could speak to someone from the family, get their perspective, perhaps that would help determine the right course of action. Thomas agreed, though the thought of making that first contact terrified him. How do you tell someone that their great-grandfather was the secret child of a royal family member? How do you prove such an extraordinary claim without sounding like a conspiracy theorist? They decided to reach out to James's granddaughter, a woman named Sarah Thompson who lived in Bristol. According to social media, Sarah was a schoolteacher, married with 2 teenage children. She seemed like a reasonable person who might be open to hearing their story. Margaret crafted a careful email, introducing herself and mentioning that she had discovered historical documents that might be of interest to Sarah regarding her family history. She kept it vague, not wanting to alarm Sarah or make wild claims in writing. Thomas waited anxiously for a response. 3 days passed with no reply, and he began to think Sarah had dismissed the email as spam or some kind of scam. But on the 4th day, Margaret received a message. Sarah was curious and willing to meet. She suggested a cafe in Bristol the following weekend. Thomas and Margaret immediately agreed, both excited and nervous about what this meeting might reveal. The truth was finally beginning to emerge, but neither of them could predict how it would be received or what consequences would follow. The cafe in Bristol was warm and crowded when Thomas and Margaret arrived that Saturday morning. They spotted Sarah Thompson sitting at a corner table, a cup of tea in front of her. She was in her early 40s, with kind eyes and an open expression that immediately put them at ease. Sarah stood to greet them, shaking their hands with a firm grip. She seemed genuinely curious rather than suspicious, which Thomas took as a good sign. After ordering coffee, Margaret began the conversation carefully. She explained that Thomas had discovered historical documents while working at Buckingham Palace, documents that appeared to involve Sarah's great-grandfather, James Thompson. Sarah leaned forward, her interest clearly piqued. She mentioned that her family had always known very little about James's early life. He had been adopted as an infant, and the details of his birth parents had never been discussed. James himself had rarely spoken about it, and after his death in 1989, the mystery had simply remained unsolved. Thomas pulled out copies of the documents he had found. He had carefully removed any direct references to the identity of Elizabeth's lover. Wanting to present the facts gradually and gauge Sarah's reaction, he handed her Elizabeth's photograph first. Sarah stared at the image for a long moment, her expression changing from curiosity to something deeper. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through her photos, then held the screen up for them to see. It was a picture of herself and her daughter. The resemblance to Elizabeth was unmistakable. The same eyes, the same gentle curve of the mouth, the same delicate features passed down through generations. Sarah's hand trembled slightly as she set down her phone. Thomas then gave her copies of Elizabeth's diary entries, the ones that spoke about the pregnancy and the birth of her son. As Sarah read, tears began to form in her eyes. She read about Elizabeth's pain, her love for the child she had to give up, her desperate hope that he would have a good life. When Sarah finished reading, she looked up at Thomas and Margaret with an expression of profound emotion. She said that knowing her great-grandfather had been so wanted, so loved, even in those desperate circumstances, meant more to her than she could express. Margaret then gently broached the more delicate subject. There was more to the story, she explained. Elizabeth had not been alone in this situation. The father of her child had been someone significant, someone whose identity had to remain secret at the time. Sarah seemed to understand where this was heading. She asked directly if they were suggesting that James had royal blood. Thomas nodded slowly, then showed her one of the letters, this time including the signature that he had previously hidden. The signature belonged to Prince Albert, the second son of King George V. He had never married during his lifetime, dying in 1942 during a military training accident. History remembered him as a dedicated servant to the crown who had put duty above personal desire. What history did not know was that he had loved Elizabeth Thompson and had fathered a child with her, a secret that had been carefully concealed to protect the reputation of the royal family. Sarah sat in stunned silence, staring at the signature. Thomas could see her mind racing, trying to process this information. She asked questions, practical questions about how they could verify such a claim, about DNA evidence, about historical records. Margaret explained that they had traced the genealogy carefully and that everything pointed to this conclusion. A DNA test could potentially confirm the connection if a comparison could be made with known royal descendants, though that presented its own complications. Thomas then told Sarah something he had not mentioned to anyone else, not even Margaret. During his research, he had discovered that the palace archives contained sealed records from that period, documents that were classified and not accessible to the public. He believed those records would contain more evidence about what had happened to Elizabeth and her child, perhaps including correspondence about the arrangements that had been made for the baby's adoption and Elizabeth's departure from the palace. But accessing those records would require authorization from the highest levels of palace administration. Sarah asked them what they planned to do with this information. Margaret was honest with her. As a journalist, she saw this as an important historical story that deserved to be told. It humanized the royal family, showed that they too struggled with love and duty, that they made sacrifices that had lasting impacts on real people's lives. But she also understood that going public with this story would dramatically affect Sarah and her family. It would thrust them into a spotlight they had never asked for and might subject them to intense scrutiny and speculation. Sarah took a deep breath and said she needed time to think. She wanted to discuss this with her husband and children, to consider what it would mean for all of them. Thomas and Margaret agreed immediately. They gave Sarah their contact information and told her to take all the time she needed. This was her family's story as much as it was anyone's, and her wishes would be respected. As they prepared to leave, Sarah stopped them and said something that touched Thomas deeply. She thanked them for caring about Elizabeth's story, for not just seeing this as a scandalous secret, but as a human tale of love and loss that deserved to be remembered with dignity. Over the next 2 weeks, Thomas continued his normal duties at the palace, but his mind was constantly elsewhere. He found himself staring at the portraits in the galleries, wondering about the secret lives and hidden stories behind those formal, painted faces. He had always viewed the palace as a place of tradition and ceremony, but now he saw it differently. It was a place where real people had lived, loved, suffered, and made impossible choices. The walls held not just history, but heartbreak. Margaret called him one evening with news. Sarah had decided that she wanted the story to be told, but only if it could be done in a way that honored Elizabeth's memory and presented the full context of the situation. Sarah had also decided that she wanted to try to access those sealed palace archives. She wanted to know everything, even if it was painful. Thomas felt a mix of relief and anxiety. Moving forward with this meant there was no turning back. Once they started asking questions about those sealed records, the palace administration would become aware of what they had discovered. The secret that had been hidden for nearly a century was about to be exposed. And Thomas had no idea how the royal family would react to this revelation from the past. Thomas knew that requesting access to sealed palace archives was not something a royal guard could do alone. He needed to involve someone with authority, someone who would take the matter seriously and handle it with discretion. After much consideration, he decided to approach Commander William Hayes, the head of palace security. Hayes was a fair man with 30 years of service, someone Thomas respected and trusted. If anyone would understand the significance of this discovery and know how to proceed properly, it would be him. Thomas requested a private meeting with Commander Hayes, which was granted for the following Monday. When the day arrived, Thomas walked into the commander's office with the metal box containing all the original documents. His palms were sweaty and his heart hammered in his chest. Hayes looked up from his desk, his expression neutral but attentive. Thomas had rehearsed what he would say, but now that the moment had arrived, he found himself stumbling over his words as he tried to explain what he had found. Commander Hayes listened in silence as Thomas laid out the entire story. He showed him the photographs, the letters, and the diary. He explained about Sarah Thompson and the family tree he had traced, spoke about Elizabeth and Prince Albert, about the child who had been given away, about the secret that had been kept for so long. When Thomas finished, Hayes sat back in his chair and was quiet for what felt like an eternity. His face revealed nothing of what he was thinking. Finally, Hayes spoke. He asked Thomas if anyone else knew about this discovery beyond his sister and Sarah Thompson. Thomas confirmed that only the three of them were aware of the full story. Hayes nodded slowly, then told Thomas something surprising. The palace had always known there were gaps in the historical record from that period. Inconsistencies that had never been fully explained. There had been rumors among older staff members about servants who had been quietly paid off and sent away, but nothing had ever been confirmed. What Thomas had discovered might finally provide answers to questions that had lingered for decades. Hayes told Thomas to leave the documents with him, and to say nothing to anyone else, while he consulted with higher authorities. Thomas felt a moment of panic at the thought of leaving the box behind, but he understood that this was now beyond his control. He had set something in motion that would follow its own course. As he left the commander's office, he felt both relieved and anxious. The burden of the secret was no longer his alone to carry, but he worried about what would happen next. 3 days passed with no word from Commander Hayes. Thomas went about his duties, trying to act normally, but the tension was eating him alive. Margaret called him repeatedly, asking for updates, and he had nothing to tell her. Sarah had sent an email asking if there was any progress, and Thomas had to reply that they were waiting. The uncertainty was almost worse than keeping the secret had been. On the 4th day, Thomas was summoned to an office he had never entered before, deep in the administrative wing of the palace. When he arrived, he found not just Commander Hayes, but also two other people. One was Lady Catherine Worthington, a senior advisor to the royal family who handled sensitive historical matters. The other was Mr. David Ashford, the palace's chief legal counsel. The seriousness of the situation was immediately apparent. Lady Worthington spoke first. She thanked Thomas for bringing this matter to their attention and assured him that he had done the right thing. The palace had spent the past few days conducting its own investigation, accessing those sealed archives that Thomas had suspected existed. What they had found confirmed everything in Elizabeth's diary and letters. There were official records of payments made to Elizabeth Thompson, correspondence between palace officials about quietly handling a delicate situation, and even a confidential memo from King George V himself, instructing that the matter be resolved with discretion and that the young woman be treated generously. The documents also revealed something else that Elizabeth had never known. Prince Albert had fought to keep both her and the child. He had wanted to defy convention, to acknowledge his son, perhaps even to marry Elizabeth despite the scandal it would cause. But the pressure from his father and the weight of duty had been too great. The king had threatened to cut Albert off from the family entirely if he pursued the relationship. In the end, Albert had yielded, but the records showed that he had ensured Elizabeth received enough money to live comfortably for the rest of her life. And he had personally arranged for his son to be adopted by a good family in Cornwall. What they had not known until now was that Prince Albert had continued to have the child watched from a distance. Private investigators had sent him regular reports on James's well-being as he grew up. Albert had known that his son had become a war hero, that he had married and started a family, that he had lived a good and honorable life. These reports had continued until Albert's death in 1942, in his final letter, written just days before the training accident that killed him. Albert had expressed pride in the man his son had become, and regret that he would never be able to tell him the truth. Thomas felt tears prick his eyes as Lady Worthington shared these details. The story was somehow even more poignant than he had imagined. These were not cold, uncaring aristocrats who had simply dismissed a servant's plight. These were people who had loved and suffered and made agonizing choices in a time when society's rules were rigid and unforgiving. Elizabeth and Albert had both been victims of circumstances that neither could control. Mr. Ashford then addressed the practical matters. The discovery posed several legal and constitutional questions. Sarah Thompson and her family were indeed descendants of Prince Albert, which made them distant relatives of the current royal family. However, because James had been born out of wedlock and had never been officially acknowledged, there were no succession implications. The family had no claim to titles or property, but they did have a right to know their heritage, and the palace was prepared to share all relevant historical information with them. Lady Worthington added that the royal family had been informed of the discovery, After much discussion, they had decided that transparency was the best approach. Rather than try to suppress this story, which would be impossible now that several people knew about it, they would work with Thomas, Margaret, and Sarah to present it properly. They wanted the story told with accuracy and sensitivity, honoring both Elizabeth and Prince Albert's memory while respecting the privacy of living family members as much as possible. Thomas was stunned. He had expected resistance, perhaps even threats or legal action to keep the story quiet. Instead, he was seeing a remarkably mature and thoughtful response. Commander Hayes explained that times had changed. The public's view of the royal family had evolved. People understood that royals were human beings with the same emotions and struggles as everyone else. A century-old love story that ended in sacrifice rather than scandal might actually help the public connect with the human side of royal history. The meeting lasted for hours as they discussed how to proceed. Margaret would be given exclusive access to write the story, working closely with palace historians to ensure accuracy. Sarah and her family would be invited to visit the palace privately, to see where Elizabeth had worked and lived, to view the portraits of Prince Albert, to connect with their hidden heritage. A small plaque would be placed in the palace gardens, in the spot where Elizabeth and Albert used to meet, commemorating their love story without revealing details that needed to remain private. As Thomas finally left the meeting, exhausted but relieved, he realized that what had started as a simple discovery during a routine patrol had become something much larger. I had helped bring to light a piece of forgotten history given a family, answers they had never expected to find, and perhaps even contributed to a more honest and human understanding of the royal family's past. The truth that had stunned everyone was now being embraced rather than buried.
Yes!
And that felt like the right ending to Elizabeth and Albert's story. 2 months after that pivotal meeting, Thomas stood in the palace gardens on a crisp spring morning. The location was the exact spot where Elizabeth and Albert had shared their secret moments nearly a century ago. Beside him stood Sarah Thompson and her family, including her teenage children and her elderly mother, who was James Thompson's daughter. The old woman had tears streaming down her face as she listened to Lady Worthington speak about her grandfather, Prince Albert, and the love he had shared with her grandmother, Elizabeth. A small group had gathered for this private ceremony. Commander Hayes was there, along with Margaret, who had spent weeks writing the story that would be published in the Times the following day. Several palace historians were present, and to everyone's surprise, 2 members of the current royal family had chosen to attend. Their presence was a powerful statement that this story was being accepted and honored rather than hidden away in shame. The plaque being unveiled was simple but elegant. It read, "In this garden, love bloomed between Elizabeth Thompson and Prince Albert in 1923, though duty and circumstance kept them apart. Their devotion remained true. This memorial honors their courage and the sacrifices made by those who loved in times when society's rules were unforgiving." Below the inscription was a small relief carving of a rose, Elizabeth's favorite flower, according to her diary. As the cloth covering the plaque was pulled away, Sarah reached for her mother's hand. The elderly woman, whose father James had never known the truth about his birth, was finally seeing her family's history acknowledged. She spoke softly, saying that her father had been a wonderful man who had always felt like something was missing from his life, some question he could never quite answer. She wished he could have known the truth, could have understood that he had been conceived in love rather than shame, that his birth father had cared enough to watch over him from afar. After the ceremony, the Thompson family was given a private tour of areas of the palace not open to the public. Thomas walked with them, pointing out the servants' quarters where Elizabeth would have worked, the corridors she would have walked, the rooms where she would have performed her daily duties. In the portrait gallery, they stood before a painting of Prince Albert in his military uniform. Sarah's daughter remarked on the resemblance between the portrait and photographs of her great-grandfather James, the same strong jawline, the same intelligent eyes, the same dignified bearing. Lady Worthington presented Sarah with a leather-bound book containing copies of all the documents related to Elizabeth and Albert's story, including the letters Thomas had found and the additional correspondence discovered in the palace archives. She also gave them something unexpected, Among the sealed records had been a small watercolor painting, created by Prince Albert himself, showing Elizabeth sitting in the palace gardens. Albert had been a talented amateur artist, and he had captured Elizabeth's gentle beauty with obvious love and skill. The painting was now being gifted to Sarah's family, a tangible connection to their ancestors. Margaret's article, when it was published the next day, caused exactly the sensation everyone had anticipated. The story of the royal guard, who discovered hidden letters revealing a century-old secret love affair, captured the public's imagination. But Margaret had written it with such sensitivity and focus on the human elements that even the most cynical readers found themselves moved. The comments and responses were overwhelmingly positive. People praised the royal family for their openness in acknowledging this chapter of history rather than suppressing it. Several historians reached out, excited about the new information this discovery provided about Prince Albert, who had always been somewhat of an enigma in royal history. His refusal to marry had been the subject of speculation for years, with some suggesting various reasons for his bachelorhood. Now it was understood that he had loved deeply, but been unable to marry the woman who held his heart. This revelation added depth and poignancy to his life story. Thomas found himself briefly thrust into the spotlight, giving interviews about the discovery and his decision to pursue the truth rather than simply filing the documents away. He spoke about Elizabeth's diary and how reading her words had made him determined to honor her wish that someone would one day discover her story. He emphasized that this was not about scandal or sensation, but about remembering real people who had lived and loved during a different era. The impact on the Thompson family was profound but manageable. Sarah gave a few carefully selected interviews, always focusing on her gratitude for finally understanding her family's history. She spoke movingly about the healing that came from knowing the full story, from understanding that James had been loved by both his parents, even though circumstances had torn them apart. Her children handled the attention well, treating their newly discovered royal connection as an interesting family history rather than something that defined them. 6 months after the discovery, Thomas was promoted within the palace security team. His superiors cited his integrity and judgment in handling a sensitive situation with discretion and respect. He continued his work at the palace, but he walked the corridors differently now. He looked at the old doors and forgotten rooms with fresh eyes, wondering what other stories might be waiting to be discovered. The palace had revealed one of its secrets, and in doing so, had become a more human place in his mind. The Thompson family maintained occasional contact with palace officials and were invited to certain historical events and exhibitions. Sarah's mother passed away peacefully, 2 years after learning the truth about her father's heritage. But she died knowing the complete story of her family and feeling a sense of connection she had never experienced before. At her funeral, Sarah read from Elizabeth's diary, the passages where Elizabeth had written about her hopes for her son's future and her prayer that he would live a happy life filled with love. Thomas kept in touch with Sarah and her family, forming an unexpected friendship that transcended the unusual circumstances of their meeting. He would occasionally visit them in Bristol, and they would share stories about their lives. Sarah's children grew up knowing they had royal ancestors, but remained grounded and focused on their own paths in life. The revelation had given them a fascinating family history without burdening them with unrealistic expectations or changing who they fundamentally were. Margaret's career flourished after the article, but she always credited her brother for having the courage to pursue the truth and the wisdom to handle it responsibly. She went on to write a book about Elizabeth and Albert's story, expanding on the article with additional research and interviews. The book became a bestseller, not because of scandal, but because of the universal themes of love, sacrifice, and the human cost of duty that resonated with readers everywhere. The storage room where Thomas had found the metal box was eventually converted into a small private museum room, accessible only by special arrangement. It housed exhibits about the lives of palace servants throughout history, with Elizabeth's story featured prominently. Visitors who were granted access could see reproductions of her letters and diary, learn about the daily life of palace staff in the early 20th century, and reflect on how much had changed in terms of social mobility and acceptance. On the anniversary of his discovery, Thomas returned to the storage room alone during his shift. He stood in the spot where he had first lifted that loose floorboard and changed everything. He thought about Elizabeth, who had hidden those documents with a desperate hope that someone would find them. He thought about Prince Albert, who had loved her enough to sacrifice his own happiness, but not enough to defy the world. He thought about James, who had lived a good life never knowing his true parentage, about Sarah and her family, who now carried that knowledge with grace and dignity. Thomas realized that finding the truth had not solved everything or made the past any less painful. Elizabeth and Albert had still been separated. James had still grown up without knowing his real parents. The sacrifices they had made could not be undone. But bringing their story to light had given meaning to their suffering. It had shown that their love had mattered, that their choices had been difficult rather than careless, and that they deserved to be remembered with compassion rather than judgment. As Thomas locked up the room and continued his patrol, he felt a deep sense of peace. He had done right by Elizabeth, honoring her wish that her story be known. He had helped Sarah find missing pieces of her family history. He had shown that even in an institution as traditional and formal as the palace, there was room for humanity, understanding, and growth. The hidden truth that had stunned everyone when it first emerged had ultimately become a story of healing and connection across generations. The palace walls held countless secrets, Thomas knew, stories of love and loss, triumph and tragedy, all woven into the fabric of history. Some would remain hidden forever, and perhaps that was as it should be. But this one story, Elizabeth and Albert's story, had been given the ending it deserved. The truth had been told, the past had been honored, and the living had been given the gift of understanding where they came from. For a royal guard who had simply been doing his job on a rainy November evening, that was more than enough. The discovery had changed his life in ways he could never have imagined, teaching him that sometimes the most important thing you can do is listen to the voices from the past and give them the chance to be heard at last.